Hi, I'm Francesca. I'm a PhD researcher in the Modelling Evidence and Policy Group at Newcastle University. And I'm going to talk to you today about some of the work that I've been doing on the literature surrounding the spatial distribution of threats to species. Now, I'm sure you're all aware, but global biodiversity is in crisis, and due to the rates of species extinctions being observed, it is now widely acknowledged that we are currently experiencing, and at the very least fast approaching, a mass extinction event. So global vertebrate populations have declined in abundance by 68% on average, which is about 98% in South and Central America. It's also now widely accepted that human life relies on stable biodiversity for services such as climate regulation, clean water, food production, and many others. And the value of these services has been estimated at $125 trillion annually. And this need to urgently do something about the biodiversity crisis is acknowledged in international targets. So much like the Paris Climate Agreement, 192 countries had signed up to a framework of targets on biodiversity under the Convention on Biological Diversity, which were meant to be achieved by 2020. However, none of these targets were fully met. And so therefore, the post-2020 framework represents a critical turning point in moving from increasingly depleting species to successfully combating the drivers of species extinctions and preventing species extinctions. And so in order to do this, we need to understand what human activities are actually driving species towards extinctions. And the short answer here, unfortunately, is everything. Everything we do impacts species somewhere in the world in some way. And so, for example, this is a graphical abstract from a study from a few years ago that analysed the frequency of different threats among IUCN Red List assessments. And as you can see, overexploitation was found to be the most frequent threat, followed by agricultural activity, urban development, and so on. And so these threatening human activities are called threats. And many interrelated processes contribute to the extinction of species, of which threats is just one part. So I'm going to break that down for you, so we're all clear in what I mean when I use the term threats. And so human activities and direct human-initiated processes occur regardless of the presence of species. And so these are termed pressures, which are the activities and processes themselves, irrespective of whether species are present. And so these pressures then become threats where they come into contact with wild species and threaten them with extinction. And the occurrence of threats triggers an ecological mechanism that results in a negative change in the state of species. And by state here, I mean indicators of its stability, essentially, such as population size, its extent of occurrence, or metrics such as the IUCN Red List extinction risk. And so it's really threats here that I'm interested in. So particularly this co-occurrence between human activities and the species themselves. So we now have a reasonable understanding of what the threats to species are around the world, but it's still unclear the full scope of where threats occur around the world. And so one tool we can use for this is threat mapping. So threat mapping is the projection of the occurrence of threats onto a geographic distribution. And so if this tool exists, why is it still unclear where the threats are? And so firstly, the term threat mapping up until this point has been used to refer to any spatial representation of threat or threats. And this includes maps of human pressures alone, like regardless of species presence, and also maps of threats to species and maps of the state of species, such as the distribution of threatened species or IUCN extinction risk categories. And because this term has been used so liberally, it makes it really difficult to distinguish how much research that actually is, just looking at this co-occurrence between species and human-driven pressures. And so in addition to this, some applications of threat mapping, this one in the middle, as I'm defining it, don't use the term threat mapping at all. And so it makes it very difficult to find and use relevant evidence. And so another challenge there is that there is a huge polarization in the literature between global applications of threat mapping and local applications. And so on a global scale, threat maps are very useful for broad scale prioritization, promoting public and policy awareness, and generating funding. Whereas local scale applications are more commonly used for fine scale conservation action planning. And so this polarization also translates into the types of methods and data that's used to generate them. So on the right, you'll see an example of a study of hunting pressure in which illegal hunting activity was directly observed via camera traps in one protected area. Meanwhile, on the left is commonly regarded to be the most comprehensive global threat map to date, in which the Human Footprint Index, species distributions, and threat data from IUCN Red List assessments will combine to produce a global map at 1 kilometre squared resolution of where threats occur. And the issue here is that intuitively, global data sets are used to produce global maps, right? And that means the data tend to be remotely observable, i.e. through satellite data, and many threats are not observable in that way. So this means that global maps often have to rely on rough proxies for those human activities. For example, human population density in this example to the left is used to represent 5 of the 7 threats that are included. And meanwhile, direct exploitation of species is represented by 3 proxies for accessibility, rather than the direct observations of exploitation that can be achieved at a local scale in the example that you see on the right. And so these 2 challenges are the main justification behind the work I'm doing. So this lack of standardized terminology and the polarization in applications results in a high risk of duplication and overlooking relevant evidence. And therefore there is a need to collect, consolidate, and characterize the evidence base to aid the uptake of existing evidence into future conservation practice, policy, and research efforts. Therefore, the question driving the work I'm about to describe is, what is the scope and extent of literature that maps the threats to species globally? What do we actually know, and what evidence actually is there? So in order to answer this question, I've undertaken a systematic map of the literature, which has involved rigorously and systematically finding the relevant literature and characterizing it by analysing data on the methodological, geographic, and taxonomic extent of existing studies that map the threats to animal and plant species. And so you'll notice here, I've included a little no tweeting symbol. That's just because the findings from this, including the number of articles that were found and included through the various stages, are technically unpublished results. And I'm in the process of getting that manuscript ready for submission. So please just don't share these findings beyond the format in which they're already being shared. Thank you. And so we published the protocol for this back in September. So this is the only thing you can share if you do want to. If you follow that QR code, that will take you to the published protocol. So that's basically the recipe, or the planned methodology that was devised beforehand. So that has already been published. So you can go and find that and read that in full if you are interested, just by scanning the QR code there. And so 3 databases were searched for published peer-reviewed literature, as well as 2 grey literature repositories and 15 organisational websites. And they were searched for relevant applications of threat mapping. And so after duplicate removal, just over 14,000 studies remained to enter into the screening process. And then so in the screening process, that involved manually reading the title, abstract, and full text of each document, comparing it against a set of inclusion criteria, and making a decision on whether that article was relevant to the investigation. So that was over 14,000 titles, almost 7,000 abstracts, and just over 3,000 full texts that were read, which yielded 1,069 relevant results, for which data was then extracted. So it's been a long process. And 20% of articles at each stage were also screened by a second reviewer to check the reliability of the decisions that were made. So what have we found by doing this? Well, firstly, the distribution of articles among spatial scales. As you can see, this reinforces that the vast majority of evidence exists at a local and subnational scale. And this means that the high volume of high resolution direct observations of threats that's not being used in coarser scale applications is potentially huge. And we also found that the volume of threat mapping evidence on animals is almost 3 times that of plants. So there's clearly a big gap for further exploration for threat maps on plants. And in terms of the distribution of threats, it's also highly uneven. The most frequent threats that we found were urban development, road and railways, aquatic resource exploitation, and alien invasive species and diseases. And it's worth noting here that the exploitation categories do also include unintentional effects. So seabird bycatch in fishing, for example, is also included in harvesting aquatic resources. And also among the less mapped threats, there is flight path, non-recreational types of intrusion, non-alien species, genes and diseases, and extreme weather in drought and flooding. Ooh. So in terms of the geographic distribution, there is a strong bias towards North America, Europe, and Australia, with China and India lesser so, but I mean primarily towards the USA. It's also worth noting here that though there is a lower scattering of articles around the African continent, a lot of those studies came from big multinational maps where they would say study the whole of North Africa or the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. They're not country specific. So everything has been included here apart from studies that were on a continental level or global level. And there's also, as you can see, a much lower volume of research on marine threats than there is on terrestrial and freshwater. And so when the data is filtered for those top 4 threats and mapped, we see that the bias towards the USA is consistent across all 4, and Brazil shows similar numbers as well across the 4 threats. Whereas in Europe, aquatic resource exploitation is a bit more heavily mapped. Meanwhile, in China, residential development and roads have been mapped quite a bit more frequently, much more frequently. And in Australia, the most mapped threat is, of the four, is invasive species. And so in terms of the taxonomic distribution as well, what we also looked at, it was the taxonomic resolution and the taxonomic scope. So what we mean by taxonomic resolution here is the lowest taxonomic unit that was mapped as a single unit. So, for example, if there was a threat map that showed a particular threat and the independent distributions of one or two species, but the different distributions of those two species could be distinguished, that would be a taxonomic resolution of species, because each species was mapped as its own distinct unit. But the taxonomic scope, say those species were from the same family, the taxonomic scope would be family, but the resolution would be genus. And so, yeah, we did that for animals and plants. And I think what is really interesting about this is that you see quite clearly that, for a start, animal species, particularly driven by mammals and birds, are more likely to be mapped at a species-specific resolution, and then more likely that the frequency of single species studies is much higher. So single species studies would be where the taxonomic scope is species, and species-specific maps would be where the taxonomic resolution is species. Whereas if you look over at the plants, the prevalence of studies where the taxonomic resolution is very, very broad. So domain, kingdom, and phylum occupy far over 50% of the literature there. And that's where, so phylum can also be vascular plants often. And they represent the majority of studies. So that high resolution taxonomic information is not being performed at the same level for plants at all as it is for animals. And so what am I going to do from here? So what I've got at the minute is a very rigorous and comprehensive assessment of the distribution of research efforts, but what I really want to get at now is the distribution of bias, and how much of that, the variation that we're seeing in the distribution of research effort is actually bias, how much of it is justified. So a lot of those threats, like for example, are they less studied because there's not a need to study them, or are they less studied for other reasons and actually there is a need to study them and that is a gap that needs to be filled? So that's what I am going to look at next, and try and really distinguish from the distribution of research effort where gaps and biases exist. And so another thing we can do in terms of like the geographic distribution is then looking at whether that's driven by the human footprint index, so where humans are, or using, for example, the star metric, so whether there is a high potential for species threat abatement and restoration. Yeah. So a big thank you to my collaborators, in particular Emily, who was my second reviewer, and screened and collected data from 20% of the articles at every stage, which was a huge, huge feat. Yeah, and thank you to yourselves for listening.